The Negro Leagues were a series of professional baseball leagues that existed from the late 19th century all the way to the 1950s. Toward the end of the 19th century, a color line developed, and black ball players were prohibited from competing in what would later become Major League Baseball. Though the reason for its creation is an ugly spot in baseball history, the leagues would go on to build a history of their own. Some of the greatest players ever passed through the Negro Leagues from 1920 till 1947, when Jackie Robinson became the first black ball player in the 20th century to be allowed to play in MLB. After his historic rookie year, many more followed, and MLB became integrated, as it always should have been before. Before long, there were black players throughout MLB, and it was proven that the best players from the Negro Leagues were just as talented as the best in Major League Baseball. That's why today, the 7 Negro Leagues that existed from 1920 onward are recognized as major leagues. But it also meant the downfall of the Negro Leagues. Their whole purpose had been to provide a place for black athletes to play ball while they were excluded from playing in MLB. Once that color barrier came down, there wasn't much reason for them to go on. One league still continued into the 1950s, but due to the departure of all the good athletes, it was quickly reduced to minor league status, and in 1958 closed its doors for good. The best black ball players could now compete in Major League Baseball with the best white ball players in a single united league, as they had always hoped they could. And of course they got to enjoy an MLB salary, making their decision to choose MLB over the Negro Leagues an easy one. But at the same time, a big part of baseball history in America was now gone forever. But what if the Negro Leagues didn't vanish in the 1950s? What if they lasted through the decades and were still around today? I'm not saying what if the color line still existed. That's a part of history no one wants to go back to. I'm saying what if the Negro Leagues were still around, still had most of the best black ball players, but the very best still went to Major League Baseball to prove themselves at the highest level. At the time of integration, there were proposals being floated around to bring the Negro Leagues into the Major League system, using them as development leagues for black prospects. But the idea didn't go anywhere. Full integration is what they were moving toward. Having black and white players develop in separate minor leagues would have been another attempt at separate but equal system, and people didn't want that anymore. So if the Negro Leagues had any chance of surviving through the second half of the 20th century, they would have to do it independently of Major League Baseball. But it would be ridiculous to think they could compete with MLB and expect to win, neither on the field nor in business. The money was too much in MLB's favor. When I think about a Negro League surviving that period and making it into the 21st century, I imagine it being something like NPB in Japan is today. Think about it, all professional players born in Japan go through NPB. They start their professional careers there. They prove themselves. Then, after being a star in NPB, they get a chance to move on to MLB and prove themselves to the world. Nowadays, the very best players usually find their way into Major League Baseball, after dominating in Japan for several years. Some of the less great ones make it over too. Some don't. Some players who are fully capable of taking their talents to MLB prefer to continue their career in Japan, where they can still make a 7-figure salary and play in front of the same size crowds seen in Major League stadiums. Let's imagine the Negro Leagues had the same setup. All the best black ball players start their careers in the Negro Leagues. After a while, they can move over to MLB. I'd imagine players would be able to make the jump a lot sooner, something equal to time normally spent in the minors, like 1 to 3 years. Maybe there would be a posting system for Negro League players, like we see with NPB players today. I won't get into that, but let's just imagine how things could have progressed from the time of integration to today. First of all, obviously, the name would not have survived. It was the correct term to use in that era, and the leagues didn't survive past that era, so it's the term we still use today. In all likelihood, there would have been a name change sometime in the second half of the 20th century, something a little more politically correct, but I won't try to guess what that name would have been. To avoid confusion, I'll go with the name we know them as, the Negro Leagues. Up until 1948, there had been 2 surviving Negro Leagues, the Second Negro National League and the Negro American League. From 1942 to 1948, the champions of these 2 leagues met in the Negro World Series. But in 1948, the remaining teams from the Negro National League merged into the Negro American League. So in 1948, they had 10 teams: the Birmingham Black Barons, Chicago American Giants, Kansas City Monarchs, Cleveland Buckeyes, Houston Eagles, Baltimore Elite Giants, Indianapolis Clowns, Memphis Red Sox, Philadelphia Stars, and New York Cubans. Another team, the Washington Homestead Grays, were a popular team from the Negro National League. But when the league collapsed, while other teams joined the Negro American League, the Grays decided to go independent. The experiment didn't go well, and they disbanded in 1951. In this scenario here, we'll assume the Grays would stick around. Knowing there's a brighter future for the Negro Leagues, they wouldn't go independent and ditch the league. So that leaves them with 11 teams. These teams moved around a lot, but for convenience's sake, let's assume it was more stable from 1948 onward. You might notice some good baseball cities missing here. St. Louis and Detroit previously had teams, but at the time did not. That's a wrong that would have to be fixed with later expansion. But that would have to wait till the league gained in popularity first. Only one New York team, the Eagles, had just moved from Newark to Houston. Having another team in the New York area would be another priority. Boston is also missing here. A good baseball town, but at the time it was less than 5% black. That explains why there was no Negro League team there. Like MLB at the time, teams were primarily located in the Northeast and Midwest, but the Negro Leagues would have had a leg up when it comes to Southern expansion, something that MLB is still lagging behind in. What actually happened in 1948 is that Willie Mays played just 13 games for the Birmingham Black Barons. Major League teams had to wait till he graduated high school in 1950 before he could sign. He played in the minors in 1950 and early 51 before making his Major League debut with the Giants during the 51 season. But in this alternative history, the Barons held the rights to the young athlete from 49 to 51. Mays dominates Negro League hitting. First MLB scouts, then later MLB fans, hear about this young ball player with amazing athletic skills never seen before. Unlike a minor league prospect, he doesn't belong to a single major league organization. He could possibly sign with any major league team. And when the Barons came to visit any major league city, or a nearby city, in 1950, people would flock to the ballpark to get their first glimpse of this future major league star and imagine him someday soon playing for their team. In that same year, fans would also take notice of a rookie infielder for the Kansas City Monarchs named Ernie Banks. The name of the team is already familiar because that's the team Jackie Robinson played for. Mays would make his major league debut in 51, just as he did in the real world. Maybe with the Giants or maybe another team would have picked him up, but his results on the field would have been the same, and it would have left major league scouts and a growing number of major league fans eager to find out who the next star player coming out of the Negro Leagues was going to be. And the following year they would not be disappointed. In 1952, an 18-year-old rookie for the Indianapolis Clowns named Henry Aaron would be displaying his talents. Hank's ability must have been obvious right from the start because he only played 3 months for the Clowns before getting signed to a major league contract with the Braves. He spent 52 and 53 in the minors before making his big league debut in 54. In this version of events, he tears it up as a member of the Clowns. For 2 summers, he's talked about by baseball fans around the country, already drawing comparisons to Willie Mays. They've seen what Willie can do, now they want to see if Hank can do the same thing, and everyone wants the chance to see him before he signs with a major league team. Fans going out to get an early look at the young Clowns infielder in 53 also notice an 18-year-old rookie named Frank Robinson. Don't know which team he'd play for since in reality he went straight to the minors. Maybe he'd play for the Clowns too. Ernie Banks makes his major league debut at the end of 53, and it becomes obvious that it's not just 1 or 2 players, but a ton of major league level talent playing in the Negro Leagues. In the real world around this time, Major League Baseball started swooping in and grabbing all the talent as soon as they could. Notice that Mays and Aaron hardly played at all with their Negro League teams before Major League clubs came knocking on their door. And it was at this point that Major League teams no longer wanted to wait that long. Any black player with any potential coming out of high school went directly to a Major League organization, just as Frank Robinson did. But in our version of events, with Mays, Aaron, and Banks being Negro League stars first, then Major League stars, the crowds got bigger, and it was time to add more teams. Cards fans in St. Louis complained that they never got to see Hank, Willie, and Ernie in their teen years. Besides, the city had just lost the Browns. There was a baseball void that needed to be filled, so they demanded a Negro League expansion team. Newark would be awarded a team once again, and this would serve as the second New York area team. Not in the city, but remember New York City at this time still had 3 major league teams. Maybe they didn't have room for a second Negro League team. Not in the city anyway. Detroit gets a team too, as they had before, and now the total is up to 14, maybe in 2 7-team divisions. 16 would be better, but they'd want to go a little at a time. Besides, the league's popularity wasn't going to slow down anytime soon. New markets would be hungry for a Negro League team of their own for many years to come. In the mid-50s, Frank Robinson gets better every year, and in 56 makes his major league debut. A year later, the bats are silenced by a 22-year-old rookie fresh out of college named Bob Gibson. A debate would ensue among Negro League fans whether Gibson was really that good, or whether the defection of Mays, Aaron, Banks, and Robinson to MLB had turned it into a pitcher's league. The debate would go on for a couple years till Gibson made his major league debut in 1959 and put an end to the debate. Now, with Negro League hitters and pitchers going on to become the best in the world, every city wants a piece of the action. Time for another expansion. While MLB began expanding westward at this time, the Negro League, though a very lucrative business, would not have had as much money to spare for travel expenses, and their expansion to the West Coast would have taken about another decade. So instead, they add to their southern market by adding a second team in Texas, probably in Dallas, and one in Atlanta. Birmingham and Atlanta are very close to one another, but I think it would work here. Atlanta was a large growing city, and the Birmingham Black Barons, a team with a long history that Willie Mays once played for, would by this time be an iconic, irreplaceable team. The 1960s kicks off with Lou Brock showing off base stealing skills never before seen in professional baseball. Negro League fans remark that there's always a new kind of talent emerging from their teams, from sluggers to pitchers, and now a base stealer. During the 60s, Major League Baseball makes several attempts to bring the Negro League into its organization, but by this time the Negro League is big enough to stand on its own, say no to Major League acquisition, and continue to operate independently. By the late 60s, the Negro League is big enough to spread across the country, with 3 teams in California, 1 in the Bay Area and 2 in LA. Probably 1 team in the city of LA, another in a nearby city, much like the Dodgers and Angels in MLB today. But the second Negro League team there would be in a city with a large black population, most likely. Just 1 more to get to 20, and I feel like they'd keep expanding in the South, though I'm not sure where. New Orleans got a team in 1957 called the New Orleans Crescent Stars. Maybe they get one here too. Or maybe they beat MLB by a few decades and put a team in Florida, or a 3rd team in Texas. Maybe they expand in the opposite direction and start one up in Canada. Or they could complete the conquering of the West Coast and expand to Seattle. I can't say for sure what their next move would be, and from here on out I won't try to guess where exactly the new teams would be located. I'll just say that the league continues to grow in popularity, and by the end of the 20th century matches MLB with 30 teams across North America. The talent train does not slow down when the 70s begin. Ken Griffey Sr., Dave Winfield, and Jim Rice bring in the new decade. By the mid-70s, they've all gone to major league teams, allowing players like Andre Dawson to grab the spotlight in the Negro League. That is, before Rickey Henderson arrives and literally steals the spotlight. In the early 80s, players like Dwight Gooden and Fred McGriff make a name for themselves, followed shortly after by Barry Bonds. In the mid-80s, 2-sport star Bo Jackson makes his professional baseball debut in the Negro League, just before starting his NFL career at the same time. Another 2-sport star arrives on the scene just at the end of the 80s. Deion Sanders juggles a career in the Negro League along with his NFL career, but the late 80s belong to guys like Ken Griffey Jr. and Frank Thomas. In the 90s, NBA legend Michael Jordan retires from basketball to pursue his dream of becoming a Major League Baseball player. And in this world, the best path to the major leagues is through the Negro Leagues. Maybe he would have played in Birmingham, as it actually happened, or maybe somewhere else. Regardless of where he played, it would draw an enormous amount of attention to an already thriving league. The Negro League would continue to be a hotbed of young talent that would go on to be major league stars, all the way up to Mookie Betts in the early 2010s, to the young black prospects we see in major league organizations today. Not every black ball player in a major league uniform today would have left the Negro League. They may have been content with their 7-figure salary and didn't feel like needing to prove themselves any further. Veteran MLB players would likely return to the Negro League toward the end of their careers for 1 or 2 final seasons, in the place where it all started. Some players would return after disagreements with their major league organizations. Right now, if players want to leave because of a disagreement and still make a somewhat comparable salary, they've got to leave the country. This setup would give the players more leverage. So you see, it wouldn't just be a place for young black prospects. A regular member of a starting lineup today might otherwise be chasing 2,000 hits for the Monarchs. A pitcher in an MLB rotation right now might be striking out 200 batters for the Homestead Grays. And those are just the black ball players we know today. In the last half-century or so, young black athletes have shifted away from baseball in favor of basketball and football, and that has resulted in fewer black American-born players on MLB rosters today. If the Negro League still existed today, a league exclusively for black baseball players, teams coached by black coaches and black managers, owned by black businessmen, would that result in more black ball players today? Impossible to say, but very likely it would. And it wouldn't just be American-born black athletes. Just as it was back in the day, foreign-born black athletes would go to the Negro League, in these cases only at first before going on to MLB. Any black Cuban defectors like Aroldis Chapman would first play in the Negro League. The league would be just as heavily invested in the Dominican Republic as MLB is. A player like David Ortiz would have spent a couple years in the Negro League before starting his Hall of Fame Major League career. Negro League teams would have academies on that island. And what about outside of the Americas? In the 21st century, we've seen MLB make a big push toward growing the game all around the world. Their efforts have taken them to all continents, trying to develop young ball players from every corner of the globe. The Negro League would not be able to be so ambitious. Not only would they lack the amount of money the MLB has, but they'd be restricted to only black athletes. So naturally, they would turn toward Africa. The African continent has been making a lot of progress in recent years as MLB has begun to take notice of the potential there, but that's all come very recently. You can understand why Africa would be low on MLB's priority list, with places like China, India, Brazil, and Europe to invest their time and money in, places much more likely to produce talented players right away. But for the Negro League, Africa would have been the next highest overseas priority after the Caribbean. They would have seen the need to grow the game to black people worldwide in order to compete with MLB's overseas market, especially in the 90s when MLB started to see a lot of Asian players arrive. Baseball would have been introduced to Africa much earlier. They would have had time to develop their skills, and by now we'd see players from various countries in Africa playing on one of the 30 Negro League teams. While MLB today can boast having players from Australia, Brazil, and Germany, the Negro League might have players from Uganda, Tanzania, Nigeria, or Ghana. So that's the Negro League in 2023, a league with 30 teams located in major cities throughout North America, a league with players and fans from the Caribbean and Africa. Baseball fans in Asia would probably take notice of this league as well, with a high success rate of Negro League players going on to star in MLB, as well as retaining some of their best talent. We'll assume that seven-figure salaries for productive players are common. The league is on par with Japan's NPB, making it one of the top 3 professional baseball leagues in the world. And that is an alternative history of how things could have looked in the last 75 years if the Negro Leagues had lived on. Of course, I am not saying they should consider this. Having separate leagues based on race is something we've long moved past, and never should have begun in the first place. However, if it had continued from that day, a few changes made, and carried on into this century, it's possible the league could have still existed today. Not in the way I portrayed it. In today's world, no player is forced to play in another league because of his race. That's not the way the modern world works. At some point, the Negro League would not automatically have the rights over any black athlete. But imagine if they all spent their earliest years playing there, and the Negro League could claim all that great talent from the past 75 years, even if just for a year or two. How strong and how popular that league would have been. There would be 2 major leagues on the continent for baseball. A totally different setup than any other professional sport has. It would be different for sure. Not going to happen, and actually never could happen for this long. Somewhere along the way it would have gone away, or existed as a much smaller league. But it's fun to imagine. Anyway, that's all for this one. Until next time, this is Baseball International. See ya.